Racist cop hits black woman, turns out she's his boss. Have you ever wondered if a simple question could change an entire life? Or if a seemingly small action could unravel the secrets of a system we believe was flawless? And what if in the most awkward of situations you had to face a truth that no one wants to confront? Would you dare to stand up and ask the questions no one else dares to ask? Imagine you are Emma Jordan, a woman with what seems like a stable mom and a quiet life. But then one day everything changes when she witnesses an unexpected event, a slap. And the person receiving it is none other than herself. But that is not the end of the story. That is only the beginning of a painful truth no one wants to face. Now, I have a question for you. What if the person slapped wasn't me? This question is not from Emma, but one she left behind in her report. A question that seems insignificant at first. Yet this very question ignited a battle between justice and silence. A single question that unravels everything we thought had been built so firmly. Before we continue, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it where you are? Leave a comment, because who knows, your thoughts may be the key to unlocking everything that's about to unfold in this story. To not miss the next chapters, let's begin. This story will not only move you, but it will open up a world of mysteries where silence itself is betrayal. In 23, the city of New Haven, one of America's largest urban centers where the bright neon lights reflect the image of towering skyscrapers in crowded streets, is a place where power is not just held by high-ranking officials, but also hidden within the layers of systems, unwritten rules. Silence and deferential respect. This city is known not only for its advancements in technology and commerce, but also for the ongoing struggles about power, justice, and fairness that unfold every day. In this city, Emma Jordan, a 30-year-old internal affairs officer, stands tall in her business attire, her sharp gaze like a razor blade, never letting any wrongdoing go unnoticed. Emma had worked for many years in the Internal Affairs Division of the police department, where she was known as one of the sharpest minds and the hardest working individuals. Her job was to uncover misconduct, dishonesty, and corruption within the police force to ensure that everyone in the system was held accountable for their actions, no matter who they were, well-trained. Emma not only had professional skills, but also the qualities of someone who fought relentlessly for justice. She was not one to easily forgive the mistakes of others, which is why she had risen to a position few could attain. But no matter how strong and determined Emma was, she could never have anticipated that she herself would become the victim in this story. Everything began when what seemed like a small incident turned into a major test for her and the system she had dedicated her life to reforming. In contrast, Nathan Cole, 32, is an experienced police officer. He has become a symbol of power in the eyes of those around him. With his tall frame and calm demeanor, Cole is not only a respected officer in the force, but also someone favored by many colleagues and superiors. He always handles difficult situations with poise and confidence, a quality admired by most of the police force in New Haven. However, what they do not know is that Cole is not the person he pretends to be in front of others. On the surface, he appears to be the model police officer, but deep down, Nathan Cole has a past filled with moral questions. He is someone who can disregard principles if it serves his personal interests, and this is something the system has not always been able to uncover. Within the system, Cole is very difficult to touch because he knows how to protect himself under the guise of power. No one dares to question his actions because, simply put, the system seems to hide the truths that no one wants to reveal, but all that will change in an unexpected moment. The story begins when Nathan Cole finds himself in a situation he could never have imagined. An event where he himself becomes the center of attention. On a typical morning in New Haven, where everything seemed to pass by peacefully, Emma Jordan was walking through the main street on her way to the office. She had a habit of walking to work every morning, a habit that made her feel calm and helped her start her day with a clear mind. But that day, everything changed forever. As she crossed an intersection, suddenly a loud noise rang out. A police officer, Nathan Cole, stepped out of his police car and, without saying a word, slapped Emma hard across the face. This slap was not a spontaneous reaction or a personal conflict. It carried a message, an insult, not just to an individual, but to the very system's injustice. And the strangest part of it all was the reaction of those around them. They were silent. No one spoke up. No one intervened. To most people, this slap was just a minor conflict between a police officer and a woman not worth speaking up about. But for Emma, it was not just a slap. It was the moment she realized that everything she had believed in for so many years was just a fragile facade. The system she had dedicated her life to protecting and reforming seemed to be the very system protecting people like Nathan Cole. In that moment, she was no longer a strong internal affairs officer, but just a woman slapped in public standing before a question no one wanted to answer. What if the person slapped wasn't me? That slap was not just an action from an angry officer. It was a sign of a power system that Emma had never fully realized. And her question, seemingly simple but with devastating power, would be the start of a battle not just with Nathan Cole, but with the very system she had trusted. It was a moment that could not be forgotten. And what happened next would be a chain of events that would make you reconsider everything you ever believed about justice, power, and silence. Emma Jordan would not accept a meaningless slap. She would fight not just to protect her dignity, but to uncover the secrets this system had hidden for so long. A sudden action with long-lasting consequences. The slap happened quickly, like a lightning bolt in the sky with no warning signs. But that brief moment caused everything built over the years. The justice system and ethics Emma had fought to uphold to suddenly collapse. When Nathan Cole slapped Emma across the face, it wasn't just the action of an angry police officer. It was the act of a man who had lived too long in a world where he knew he would never be held accountable for his actions. Thanks to the strong protection of a system he always believed he could exploit, Emma was not like the others. She did not see this as a simple act of violence. It wasn't a fleeting moment of anger. It was a symbol of everything wrong with a system she had spent her life fighting against. She was not a silent victim. Never. Emma knew that if she remained silent, she would be complicit in perpetuating these mistakes. Immediately after the slap, Emma didn't run, cry, or seek sympathy from those around her. She knew she wasn't just facing a police officer who had acted wrongly. She was confronting a system that had long nurtured and protected such behaviors. This system was not just a group of people, but a solid wall that shielded wrongful actions. That's why, unlike many other victims, Emma decided to document the incident and write a report with the question, what if the person slapped wasn't me? This simple question contained a powerful message. Emma wasn't just criticizing Nathan Cole's action. She was targeting the entire legal system he represented. It wasn't just an act of violence. It was a symbol of inequality and a power divide. Emma's question was a call for awakening, a reminder of the forgotten people in society, those who don't have an identity to be protected. She wanted to show everyone that in this society, if you don't hold an important position, you could be slapped without anyone daring to speak up. The first confrontation, the limits of protection. Not long after Emma's report reached the hands of those in charge at the police department, at that moment, the higher-ups could no longer remain passive. They began to realize that what Emma had written in her report could lead to consequences they could not control. Their system, which had long been accustomed to protecting powerful figures like Cole, now faced a major challenge. If they let Emma's report slip by without action, it could mark the collapse of their entire system. If they didn't handle this issue carefully, they would not only lose public trust, but could also fall into a situation that would spiral out of control. Empowered, the leaders in the police department began to plan a cover-up. An internal meeting was immediately called with the goal of minimizing any potential fallout from this incident. A quick proposal was put forward. We can simply remove the question from Emma's report. We just need to keep the slap incident in the internal records and not let it go public. They didn't specify what removing the question would mean, but it was clear they wanted her to remain silent and not disrupt the system. However, things were not that simple. Emma was not someone who could be easily subdued. She didn't just stop at documenting the incident. She decided to take more powerful action. She couldn't let them erase her question, so she did something no one expected. She made her report public. Emma's resistance. Unlike what the system imagined, Emma did not bow to the pressure of power after her report was dismissed. She decided to act. One morning when her colleagues and superiors had left the office, Emma entered her workspace, grabbed the report, scanned the documents, and uploaded the entire content onto the police department's internal investigation system. She didn't just make the report public to those in power in the department. She made it accessible to all department staff without any password or restriction. She didn't need to explain anymore. Everyone would understand. She added a short note to the report. This data will be used for ethical training purposes. A simple but symbolic act emphasizing that this issue was not just hers, but belonged to the entire system, to everyone involved in that system's functioning. She didn't need to speak. Her question had already said it all. What if the person slapped wasn't me? Meanwhile, within the police department, tensions began to rise. Those who disagreed with Emma's actions could not stop worrying about the potential consequences. Continuous meetings were held trying to figure out how to deal with the situation. A group of leaders in the department began to implement a damage control campaign, with some suggesting that the impact could be minimized by erasing any information related to the incident, even Emma's report. But others feared that deleting the documents would only make things worse. Some leaders realized that this issue could become a media storm, and they didn't want it to spiral out of control. Meanwhile, those who stood behind Officer Cole grew more nervous than ever, fearing that their positions in the system would be affected. Emergency meetings were held continuously to find a solution, but by this point, Emma was no longer someone who could be controlled. She had challenged everything. The inevitable confrontation. Under the threat of a looming media crisis, the system began to face itself. Yet in front of everyone, Emma had a question that needed to be answered. Would this system continue to protect wrongdoing? Or would there be real change? And this answer would come in an inevitable confrontation, where Emma would have to face not only Nathan Cole, but the very system she had always trusted. A divide begins within the system. Emma's simple yet challenging question quickly spread, sparking a strong public reaction. That question was not just a line in a report. It became a symbol of the struggle, not just for an individual, but for the entire system. The question didn't just raise an issue of fairness. It was also a protest against the values that had long existed within the legal system. Outsiders began to split into two clear factions. Some sympathized with Emma, seeing courage and determination in her question. They believed it was time to face the truth, to expose everything society had been trying to hide for so long. They saw Emma not just as a woman slapped in public, but as a symbol for all those who had been forgotten, those without an identity to protect. These were mostly people who had suffered from discrimination, harassment, or unfair treatment, and they stood by Emma as allies in the fight for justice. However, a significant portion of the public felt that Emma's question was nothing more than a stunt. They believed she was exploiting this situation to attack the system, to serve personal interests, rather than seeking true justice. They argued that this wasn't a struggle for the truth, but a strategy to gain attention while disrupting a system full of problems that needed fixing. To them, Emma wasn't standing up for justice. She was manipulating and dividing what had already been built. This divide didn't only happen outside society. It began to creep into the police force itself. Colleagues who had worked with Emma, people she had once trusted, now had different reactions. Some, though they didn't openly express it, started to feel uneasy working with her. They no longer saw her as the reliable teammate who could be trusted for fairness and integrity, but instead began questioning her methods. Colleagues turned their backs on Emma. For Emma's colleagues in the police force, her question was not only a challenge to Nathan Cole, but also a challenge to the entire system they served. To them, what Emma called justice seemed to infringe upon their private space. They had grown accustomed to silence, working by the book, never questioning the decisions within the system. For them, facing the truth too soon could complicate everything and potentially disrupt what they had built over the years. Some colleagues, those who had once shared intense moments with Emma, now began to feel uncomfortable as they watched her continue to push further in this fight. They didn't see justice in her actions, but rather fatigue and growing pressure from this ongoing struggle. They weren't bad people, but the turmoil she caused forced them to confront a reality they weren't ready to accept. Some colleagues even started to avoid Emma, no longer sharing stories or discussing work like before. They no longer saw clarity in her decisions. Emma became an opposing figure in their eyes, not because she was wrong, but because she dared to disrupt the order they had lived with for so long. Her fight was not seen as an embodiment of justice in their eyes, but as an upheaval, a threat to what they had come to accept: internal struggles within the system. Not only did public opinion begin to shift, but internal divisions within the system also began to emerge. Internal meetings started to happen continuously, and leaders within the police department could no longer maintain the consistency they once had. Some began to worry about the consequences of this incident. They feared that if the truth were exposed too widely, It would tarnish the police force's reputation and cause the public to lose trust in them. These people were trying to figure out ways to mitigate the damage that Emma's question could cause. However, there were also members of the police force who stood by Emma. They weren't afraid to face the truth. They believed it was time for change, and Emma was the one brave enough to stand up for it. These individuals were no longer willing to cover up wrongdoing. They knew that ignoring actions like Nathan Cole's would only make everything worse. They felt that if they didn't stand up now, they would be sinking deeper into a system that could no longer be saved. Reactions from senior leaders in the police department. The divide didn't just appear among Emma's colleagues, but also among the senior leaders in the police department. Some high-ranking officials quickly acted to protect their interests in the system they served. They sought to cover up all information related to the incident, even blocking the spread of information about the slap and Emma's question. Some senior leaders even participated in secret meetings trying to hide the documents that Emma had uploaded to the internal investigation system. However, these leaders were also aware that if they continued to protect Nathan Cole and cover up everything related to the incident, they could lose the public's trust. A media crisis could erupt, potentially destroying all the credibility they had worked so hard to build. Over the years, Emma's question hadn't just shaken their system. It had forced them to question the sustainability of the very principles they had always protected. The inevitable confrontation. Emma's question caused a massive wave not only in public opinion but also within the police department itself. The internal debates, the fractures within the system were becoming more apparent than ever. The department leaders were now facing an unavoidable situation. They couldn't remain silent any longer. They couldn't continue to protect wrongdoing. Emma's question was a call to wake up, a challenge to the entire system. The confrontation between Emma and Nathan Cole wasn't just between two individuals. It was a confrontation between old values and the changes society was beginning to embrace. Would the system have enough courage to face the truth? Or would it continue to protect the wrongs? Emma's question had pushed everyone to a crossroads, and only time would tell whether true justice would be served or if it would remain a beautiful theory suppressed beneath the weight of power and fear. The system begins to protect. Nathan Cole, since the slap Emma received, the silence and cover-up by higher-ups in the system have become increasingly evident. What started as a personal incident between Emma and Nathan Cole had now touched on the deeper issues within the police and legal system that had long been hidden. Once this issue came to light, the forces in power wasted no time using all means necessary to protect Nathan Cole and conceal the truth. From the start, the higher-ups in the system understood that this incident could shake the public's faith in the police force. They knew that if the truth spread and continued to cause waves in society, it could be the end of many careers. Instead of allowing justice to speak, the system chose to protect the wrong and ensure everyone remained silent, cover up, through editing and removal of evidence. One of the first actions taken by the system was to edit the reports related to the incident. The copies of the original reports Emma had submitted were altered with important details removed or changed. This not only violated principles of justice, but also clearly demonstrated a deliberate cover-up. One of the most disturbing changes was the removal of Emma's challenging questions. These were replaced with vague information designed to obscure the truth. However, editing and clouding these reports wasn't just a typical cover-up. Behind this was a clear strategy to suppress anyone who might stand up against the system. The system had taken calculated steps to erase every trace of the truth, including deleting the video of the slap between Nathan Cole and Emma. When this video was leaked, it immediately attracted the attention of the public. Thousands of people saw and witnessed the wrong Nathan Cole had done. This video wasn't just crucial evidence. It was a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. However, as soon as the video went viral, leaders in the police department ordered it to be removed from all official media channels. It seemed they believed that without the video, the incident would quickly be forgotten. But they failed to realize that in today's digital age, the truth could not be so easily hidden. Impact on Emma's colleagues. As the system tried to protect Nathan Cole, these actions began to directly impact those within the police department. Emma's colleagues, those who had once shared the job and fought alongside her in tense investigations, were now feeling the pressure of an invisible force. Some of them, instead of continuing to support Emma in the fight for justice, began to pull back. They were being pressured to remain silent, and rumors began circulating within the system. Some in the police force were growing tired and overwhelmed by this fight. They didn't understand why Emma was continuing with a struggle that seemed pointless. and they didn't want to be the ones continuing to oppose the system they had served for so long. Some colleagues, especially those in higher positions, started gradually turning their backs on her. Some even began to avoid her, no longer exchanging work or offering support when she needed it. These individuals slowly realized that if they sided with Emma, they could become targets of punishment from the system. And in an environment where every decision could affect their careers, standing with someone considered to be causing trouble was a risky move. Emma stands her ground. However, Emma was not the type of person to be easily subdued. She knew that no matter how hard the system tried to protect Nathan Cole, no matter how many forces tried to stop her, she had to continue her path in search of the truth. She wasn't fighting for personal gain, but for those who had been overlooked by the system, for the victims who had no voice in society. Emma knew that her question wasn't meant to end everything, but to challenge the system, to push it to a crossroads that no one had dared to cross before. Her question wasn't a simple request, it was a great challenge to the values the system had upheld for so many years. And Emma wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of losing friends, of losing colleagues, or of being isolated. She was only afraid of one thing: giving up, the fight against the cover-up. She continued her investigation, continued requesting documents, continued speaking out, even as she was surrounded by silence and cover-ups. She knew she couldn't change everything immediately, but she also knew there was one thing she could do: not let the truth be buried. She couldn't allow people like Nathan Cole to continue to exist in a system they had exploited to manipulate power and suppress justice. She continued to walk in the darkness of the cover-up, while the leaders of the system tried to block all her efforts. But with every step, Emma wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who would never have the chance to speak up, facing hardships and isolation. The question that Emma raised didn't only disrupt the system, but also forced her to face the isolation within her own work environment. She was not only up against a system that protected Nathan Cole, but also had to contend with the doubt from her colleagues, the lack of support from those she had once considered friends. But the deeper she delved into the investigation, the more Emma realized that this was the challenge she had to overcome. The system's cover-up only strengthened her resolve. She didn't need the help of those too afraid to stand with the truth. All she needed was to keep believing in herself, in the work she was doing. Her question, though it had caused a storm within the system, was the light that guided those seeking justice. She didn't falter. She didn't stop. Because Emma understood that sometimes a simple question could change an entire system that was sinking in deceit. Emma faces isolation from her colleagues. Though Emma had never been one to seek attention, she began to feel the weight of isolation more clearly with each passing day. After she boldly stood against Nathan Cole and the system protecting him, her colleagues started to distance themselves from her. Important meetings where she had once contributed, her voice now became spaces where Emma could only stand outside and listen. She was no longer included in the crucial discussions, those meetings where decisions about her future and that of her colleagues were made without her input. The tears didn't fall from her face, but the loneliness in those moments was more profound than ever. The system not only isolated her from the meetings, but gradually stripped her of control over her daily work. Files no longer arrived directly at her desk. Investigations that she had once led were now assigned to others. Colleagues she had once trusted, people who once shared her belief in justice, now became people who no longer trusted her choices. They were either too afraid of the system's pressure or simply lacked the courage to stand up for her. They were exhausted by this fight, and many of them began to turn their backs, feeling that Emma was making things more complicated and difficult. Isolation becomes a lesson. With each meeting from which she was excluded, with each discussion she was not a part of, Emma gradually realized that she could no longer rely on anyone in the police force to stand firm. None of her old colleagues were brave enough to continue with her. Those she had helped, those who had once trusted and supported her, now only remained silent or looked at her with suspicion. They no longer saw Emma as an essential part of the system, but as a danger that needed to be removed. However, this isolation didn't make Emma give up. On the contrary, it made her stronger. The tears she couldn't shed in public were hidden in the resilience she built within herself. She didn't need the approval of others. She didn't need the support of those she had once fought alongside. The tears were not a sign of weakness, but proof of a tenacity that not everyone could understand. Emma's coldness becomes her weapon. Unlike others, Emma didn't express her frustration with anyone. She didn't scream. didn't blame, and didn't try to create confrontations. Instead, she chose to remain silent. She didn't speak of the injustices she had to endure, nor did she show signs of weariness or disappointment. She simply continued her work with a cold and unwavering determination. She didn't show the pain she was feeling when she was excluded from important meetings. She didn't allow herself to be a victim. Instead, she proved to everyone that despite the system's efforts to cover up and remove her, she remained standing. She worked quietly without the need for recognition or support. Each passing day, Emma demonstrated to those around her that isolation wasn't a sign of weakness, but an opportunity for her to find strength within herself. Ciao, Tuntun. The struggle between ideals and reality. Despite everything, the isolation and hardships she faced were not an easy process. The tears she could not let others see still burned in her heart. Tears not for herself, but for those she was fighting for. She didn't cry for her own pain, but because she knew that other victims would never have the chance to rise like she had. Those without a voice in this system would have to continue living in fear and repression, just as she had when she was a child. Yet in the long, lonely nights, Emma sometimes couldn't help but feel tired. She remembered the early days when she first started working there, when she was full of passion and believed in the system. She remembered the colleagues who had helped her through so many trials, those who now seemed like strangers. But Emma didn't allow herself to linger in those thoughts for too long. She understood that if she let loneliness win, she would lose the reason to keep fighting. And she knew her fight was not just for herself, but for a greater ideal. The ideal of justice alone, but not defeated. Isolation was a harsh challenge for Emma, but at the same time it became the driving force that kept her going. She refused to let herself become a victim of loneliness. She continued to fight, not for fame, not for recognition, but simply because she knew that if she didn't, this system would never change. She understood that no matter how lonely it got, she had to keep fighting, because if she gave up, no one else would stand up for her. Meanwhile, her colleagues gradually became drawn into the power of the system. They no longer had the courage to stand with the truth. As for Emma, with each step she took in this battle, she became stronger, and she understood that sometimes isolation is not defeat, but a necessary condition to build a more just future for all. The question gains widespread recognition. Since Emma wrote that question, what if the person slapped wasn't me? In her report, it was no longer just a note in an official document. It quickly transcended the limits of an internal issue within the police force, becoming a symbol of justice and resistance against social injustice. Emma's question began stirring up social foundations, online forums, and podcasts, not only within the police community, but also spreading across all layers of society. This question became the rallying cry for those fighting for justice. It was like a shout from the oppressed, a reminder of the disparity in treatment between those with power and those without. Strangely yet truly fascinating, when this question started to spread, not only ordinary citizens, but even those within the police force who had previously remained silent in the shadows began to reflect on their own work. A powerful wave of ideas and stories started to be shared, and all tied to Emma's simple yet powerful question. Civil rights groups, anti-racism organizations, and social justice advocates embraced this question as a new symbol. Young people, especially Gen Z, began using Emma's question in posts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram as a statement that they would not tolerate discrimination and injustice anywhere, anytime. Posts spread rapidly, with each question becoming a campaign calling for change, even though not all participants fully understood the profound meaning behind it. One of the popular podcasts about social justice took Emma's question and made it the subject of a special episode. The question was constantly discussed in workshops, forums, and public events. People began to ask themselves whether Emma was the only one brave enough to raise questions about a system that had long only validated what the system wanted to acknowledge, or if this was a wake-up call for all those who felt marginalized by the forces of power. Sure. Resistance becomes a movement. What is striking is that not only people in civil society, but even within the police force, young recruits began embracing Emma's question and turning it into a movement. These new recruits, unburdened by the realities of the system, unafraid of isolation, started to challenge the old theories they had been taught. They asked why justice was reserved for some and denied to others. These individuals weren't rebels, but they were seeking change in a system they had joined with a belief in fairness. Emma hadn't faced isolation and injustice alone. Her question had become a beacon for others, those who had always felt forgotten in discussions about justice. As she had hoped, her question didn't just change the way people viewed power and discrimination. It sparked a wave of resistance. Questions with no answers became cracks in a system that was supposed to be steadfast. Emma had ignited the fire of truths no one had dared to confront. Protests started in major cities, from small student group demonstrations to larger parades gathering thousands. Participants held signs that read, "What if the person slapped wasn't me, and we could all be victims?" These slogans spoke not only of society's opposition to discrimination, but also of the voice of the oppressed, the forgotten victims in the ongoing maintenance of societal order. Emma's question had become a symbol of justice, a question that no system of power could extinguish. The system reacts but cannot stop. Although the system tried to diminish the power of this question, erasing any traces that could link it back to Emma, the resistance could not be quelled. Officials within the police force attempted to cover up, even claiming that Emma's question was merely a political act, a personal agenda. But that question had touched the public's conscience deeply. Those who sought to hide the truth realized that when a question is strong enough, it can shake the entire system, exposing cracks they never saw. Some within the police force who had once been hesitant or unwilling to participate in change began to speak out. They began not only questioning Emma's question, but also asking themselves questions about their own actions, about the work they were doing, and about what they were really protecting. These questions weren't just a call for change. They were a warning to those who had long seen justice distorted and to those who thought power could dictate everything. The awakening of a generation one. Undeniable fact is that Emma's question sparked an awakening for a new generation. This generation no longer accepted discrimination, no longer accepted that the wrongdoings of those with power would be overlooked simply because they held a title or position in society. They were no longer afraid of the system and were ready to question things they had once been taught were unquestionable. Emma's question didn't just shed light on an issue within the police force. It opened up a revolution in how society viewed power, justice, and responsibility. Nathan Cole is no longer untouchable. Nathan Cole, once a symbol of power within the police force, no longer stood atop his mount of confidence. The story of the slap he delivered, along with Emma's question, "What if the person slapped wasn't me?" had changed everything. The days when he proudly relied on the protection of the system and the untouchability of his power were over. Now Nathan could no longer avoid the consequences of his actions. As the story of the slap spread not only within the police community, but also across the media, Nathan could no longer remain silent. His image, once that of a powerful man in uniform, now became a symbol of arrogance and lack of control. Emma's question, though simple, carried with it a deep irony that had shaken the very foundation Nathan had once stood upon. He was no longer a man to be admired, but instead he had become a man criticized, condemned, and cast out by society. The videos of Nathan's slap articles criticizing his actions, intense interviews became a permanent part of the public discourse. The video of the slap, though removed from official channels, continued to circulate on social media, being shared, repeated in conversations, and becoming a symbol of injustice. Nathan could do nothing to deny the truth. The blindness of power. No one could deny that Nathan had once been a model officer in the police force, a man regarded as a paragon of loyalty and responsibility. However, what he failed to realize and refused to admit was that the blindness caused by power had prevented him from seeing the truth. Power had clouded his vision, causing him not to recognize that he was walking down the wrong path. Nathan had become accustomed to being protected by the system he had devoted his life to. Every wrongdoing of his was covered up, every violation justified. The system protected him, and he had believed that protection would last forever. He felt untouchable and as a result acted arrogantly without considering the consequences of each decision he made. However, when Nathan's slap caused a public uproar, he could no longer live within the protective bubble he had created for himself. This action didn't just break the pride of a man, it revealed cracks in the system he had trusted. Emma's question, though short, had caused people in society to start reevaluating the power disparities they had long accepted. And that question, with all its potential strength, had challenged even those at the top of the system. Reactions from colleagues and gradual isolation. While the public's attention was beginning to focus on Nathan, His colleagues in the police force had mixed reactions. Some within the force began to feel uncomfortable, no longer trusting him as they once had. They started to see that Nathan was no longer the embodiment of discipline and justice they had admired. The relationship between Nathan and his colleagues began to grow tense. Some people, though they did not speak up, publicly began to quietly distance themselves from him. Nathan was no longer invited to important meetings and major decisions began to be made without his input. He realized that the isolation from his colleagues was the clearest sign of a change in how he was viewed within the system he had once been an integral part of, not only within the police force, but even in discussions among political leaders and social analysts. Nathan's name began to be dragged into debates. He was no longer an untouchable figure, but had become an example of the dangers of unchecked power. The collapse in career and reputation. Nathan could not avoid being pulled into investigations about his actions. The leaders of the system began to realize they could no longer protect him. The justifications they had previously used to cover for him were no longer effective. Emma's question had exposed a truth that everyone had to face. Power cannot control everything, and there is a limit that even people like Nathan Cole cannot surpass. With the increasing media interviews surrounding the incident, Nathan gradually realized that the excuses he presented only deepened his own downfall. He could no longer maintain his image as the arrogant man standing above others. Every explanation he provided only made him lose more trust from the public and his colleagues. Day by day, Nathan's collapse in his career and reputation became unstoppable. Each time he appeared before the public, people remembered the slap, remembered Emma's question. Every step he took, every decision he made was now viewed through a completely different lens. No one saw him as a hero anymore. He was just a man who let power blind him and paid the price with his career and reputation. Nathan faces the truth. In the end, Nathan had to face the truth. He could no longer deny the changes that had occurred in society, and he could no longer continue living in the protection of the system he had once trusted. Emma's question had made him reflect on his actions and the system he had defended for so long. That question was not just a challenge. It was a mirror reflecting everything he had done, everything he had overlooked. Nathan Cole, once convinced of his invincibility, now had to face undeniable consequences. His story, from a protector of justice to a wrongdoer, had become a valuable lesson for everyone. Power is not eternal, and no one, no matter how powerful, can escape the consequences of their actions. The encounter between two adversaries. As the story of the slap and Nathan Cole's downfall spread, public attention remained fixated on the confrontation between Emma and Cole. Criticism, outrage, and voices demanding justice made everything more tense than ever before. However, one thing that no one expected was that Nathan, the one seen as the culprit in the incident, would proactively request to meet Emma in a private meeting with no one else present. From the beginning, Emma had no intention of facing Cole, not because she lacked the right, but because she felt there was nothing more to prove. What she had done had already been clear, not to punish, but to awaken. But Cole, in the exhaustion and loneliness brought on by his own mistakes, felt the need to meet Emma, not to apologize, but to test himself. It was a subtle move in the world where he had long been accustomed to power and invisible protection. Perhaps part of him still hoped that this meeting would clarify what had been left unsaid. And so the meeting was set, the encounter between two conflictual individuals. When Emma entered the room where the meeting was to take place, she immediately sensed the cold atmosphere, the empty space of confrontation. No words were spoken, no greetings exchanged. Cole was there sitting in his police uniform, but no longer the powerful figure he once was. Now he was just a man, helpless, facing mistakes that could not be undone. Emma did not sit down, stood arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the person across from her. Both of them remained strangely silent, not because there was a lack of words, but because there had been so many words spoken already that no words could resolve anything anymore. Emma simply stared at Cole, her eyes not filled with anger or hatred, but with coldness and determination. She no longer needed to argue, no longer needed to struggle. She had once faced the system, and now it was time to face an individual within that system. Nathan could not remain silent in that stillness. He could ignore all the interviews and threats from the public, but he could not stay silent when facing Emma, the person who had forced him to confront himself. He nodded finally, speaking. Emma, I don't know where to begin. I just want to meet you, not to justify myself, but to say that I know I was wrong, but I don't know how to apologize enough. Emma did not respond immediately. She turned and walked toward the desk in the room where a laptop was open. There was no rush in her actions, only a composed yet commanding presence. She said nothing as she opened the video of the slap, the video Nathan had tried to erase but could not stop from spreading. The video only lasted a few seconds, but it contained everything Emma needed to show silence stronger than any words. Emma did not need to say a word. No question, no statement was needed. She simply allowed Cole to see himself in the video. The video recorded the moment when, with all his confidence, he slapped her in the street. It was a slap, not just physically, but also mentally, against the rights and dignity of those who had no voice in society. The room was silent, only the sound of the video playing from the speakers. Nathan stared at the screen, unable to deny that it was he who had delivered that slap. He did not look at Emma nor at anyone else, only at himself. The video did not need to be explained nor justified. It spoke for itself. The slap was not merely a physical act. It was a declaration of power, of the system's protection and the arrogance of those in power. Though it was considered a mistake, it had become a symbol of everything the system sought to conceal: injustice, discrimination, and the contempt for those who did not belong to the important people. Nathan reflects on himself. Nathan sat there saying nothing, his eyes vacant as though he was facing a reflection of himself. With each passing second, Nathan felt his own collapse. The slap he delivered was not just the mistake of an individual, but a symbol of the system that had nurtured his arrogance. The system had taught him that power was everything, and that as long as he remained silent and steadfast, everything would be fine. But now, as he faced the reality, there was no way to deny it. Emma did not need to justify or criticize. She simply stood there, showing him exactly what he had done, allowing him to realize the consequences of his actions. This was stronger than any words people like Nathan, who had lived under the protection of the system for so long, would never truly understand the price of their arrogance until they were brought to the light, the meeting without excuses. In the end, Nathan could not hold back his tears. Part of him had broken, not from regret, but because he realized everything had spiraled out of control. He had once believed he could freely decide the fate of others, but now he could no longer decide his own fate. The cost of power was loneliness and pain that could never be erased. Emma did not leave the room immediately. She stood there for a long while, not to continue the confrontation, but to end it with silence. Finally, when she turned to leave, her steps were soft yet determined. This meeting was not a condemnation, but an ending with no excuses. The silence after the storm. When the door closed behind her, no one spoke again. Nathan remained seated, feeling an inescapable sense of silence. The slap was not just an action. It was a wake-up call for the entire system, and Nathan was the one who had caused that awakening. Not because he wanted to, but because his actions had exposed a truth that no one could hide. Emma did not need forgiveness from Nathan, and Nathan could not deny what he had done. But the people outside, those who had witnessed this story, had realized that sometimes silence is the most powerful thing. It does not need to protect anyone, but it forces everyone to confront themselves. Nathan Cole admits fault and withdraws. Nathan Cole's surrender did not come from direct legal pressure or the barrage of public criticism. It was a silent withdrawal, a final act not to protect himself, but to awaken. As an experienced officer, Cole had once believed he was invincible, a model of strength and resolve within the force. But after everything that had happened after the slap and its unforeseen consequences, Cole realized that the power he had once wielded was nothing more than an illusion, a fragile shield that could not conceal his own mistakes. On that day, a resignation letter was written. No delay, no long explanations, no justifications for his mistakes. It was simply a short letter. Just a few lines, but it was all he could admit to himself and to society. Dear all, I write this letter to inform you that I am resigning from my position. I realize that I am no longer worthy of the badge on my chest, no longer fit to hold the position I once considered to have unlimited power. I do not wish to be the burden on this system any longer, as I failed to understand the power and responsibility it entails. I apologize for not fulfilling my duty, and I hope that through this resignation, I can find the true path for myself. These were the final words from a man who had once prided himself on his badge, but in them there was no anger, no loud regrets, only a silent admission of an irreversible failure. This was not surrender to the law or to public pressure. This resignation was the surrender of a man who had lost everything, not because he lacked power, but because he had realized that the power had been a false facade for far too long. Surrender is not the end. But Cole's surrender was not the end of the story. It was not the end for him, but the beginning of a lesson he had to learn. A lesson that would be passed on to those who witnessed his life and actions. When Nathan Cole's name was no longer tied to reverence and power, he became a symbol of arrogance taken to its limit only to collapse under the blindness of his own making. He came to understand that arrogance can never be built on a foundation of truth, and that if you do not acknowledge your true self, no one will trust you when you need them the most. In the end, in a letter no one expected, Cole admitted what he had never wanted to admit, that power is not something that can last forever unless it is built on the solid foundation of humanity and justice. And in that very surrender, Nathan Cole learned a valuable lesson about never underestimating the power of truth, because only when it is lost does one truly realize its worth. A mark in the system, but Cole's resignation was not just a personal action, it reflected the system itself. A system that once had individuals like him, those who forgot that at the end of the road, they would have to face the inevitable consequences. Nathan Cole was not the only one to fall from grace, but he became the clearest symbol of what power can do to blind a person. And in his surrender, Cole became a part of a larger lesson: self-awareness, acknowledgement of mistakes, and an awakening to the true values that power should never lose. The day Cole submitted his resignation, a silent wave rose within the system. No one dared to speak up immediately, but everyone knew that Cole's surrender was a powerful warning to anyone who thought they could bypass the rules, the fundamental principles of justice. The system was never perfect, but because of that, those working within it must always ask themselves, am I doing the right thing, and do I deserve the power I hold? The days after after Cole's resignation letter was made public, he no longer found himself at the center of attention. He had become a forgotten name in the system he once revered. Those who had once praised him now fell silent. The meetings he had once regularly attended no longer occurred. No one wanted to mention his name, as his resignation carried with it something irreparable. The boycott began within the ranks, gradually spilling out into society. Cole did not receive a single phone call of apology from anyone in the system. He did not receive condolences from those who had once been his colleagues. They all remained silent, as if they had forgotten what he had done. And though many could never forget his actions, they no longer felt the need to mention his name. This resignation was not just the end of one person's story, but the end of a flawed system. It illuminated one truth: no one can live forever in the glory of arrogance without paying the price. And above all, Nathan Cole's surrender was a wake-up call for all those in power, reminding them that no one can escape the truth, no matter how hard they try to hide it. By resigning, Cole not only left his job, but he also abandoned a part of himself that he had lost while living under the shadow of power. Emma stands up, leading a new generation. In the end, after all the turmoil, the isolation, and the battles, Emma Jordan rose up. But this time she wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for a bigger ideal, for a new generation, for a more just society. She was no longer just the protagonist in the story of a slap and the disgrace of a system that had protected the wrongdoers. But Emma had become a symbol of change, a beacon of hope for those who believed in justice in a complex, conflicted society. Her invitation to speak at the Police Academy's commencement ceremony for a new training class wasn't a coincidence. It marked a turning point, a moment where Emma was seen not as a victim, but as a leader. Everything she had gone through, everything she had dared to do, had now become the guiding light for those willing to listen and face the truth. At the ceremony, the young trainees standing at the threshold of a career they believed would shape their lives all looked towards Emma. She was no longer the Emma Jordan of her early days, a young officer filled with ambition, but uncertain of her path. She was no longer just a female officer in a system that had helped thousands of people. She had become the embodiment of resilience and unwavering justice. A powerful speech. She stood there without fanfare, without flowery words. Just one simple sentence, yet packed with an invisible power no one could deny. There are two kinds of people who will wear this uniform. One believes they stand above the law. The other understands they must live by it, even more than the law itself. With these words, Emma not only clarified the distinction between an officer following orders and one who truly embodies justice, but she also opened up a dialogue about the power of ethics in law enforcement, about facing mistakes and accepting the truth without ever stepping back. She made everyone present at the ceremony reflect not only on their careers, but on the purpose of wearing that uniform. Is it just a ticket to a system that protects personal interests? Or is it a pledge to protect justice, to stand up when necessary and never accept wrongdoing? Emma wasn't there to recount her own story. She didn't stand there to talk about the pain she'd endured or to pity herself. She simply made one point that everyone understood. One individual can change an entire system, but only when that person is brave enough to face it and not fear change. Change doesn't just come from the system, but from those within it. Emma's words weren't just a lesson on ethics and justice. They were a wake-up call for everyone present. She wasn't just setting an example for the younger generation. She was reminding everyone in the system that change isn't something beyond their reach, but a continual process that starts from within. With those words, Emma sent a powerful message about holding on to ethics and justice, even in the hardest times. Her story didn't just change society's perception of justice. It sparked a belief that anyone could change, and that each of us could create that change, even when everything seems to be against us. Silence in the challenge that never fades. Emma's story didn't stop at a personal incident. It wasn't just about the slap Nathan Cole gave her. It was a reminder for everyone who had stood silent in the face of wrongdoing, for those who had ignored the truth for the sake of safety or personal interests. Emma's question wasn't just about one incident. It was a question about the entire system, about the power dynamics between those with power and those without it. Since Emma first asked, "What if the person who was slapped wasn't me?" her question became a slogan, a symbol of resistance challenging old prejudices and defending the marginalized in society. Those who followed Emma weren't just witnesses to her story. They were the ones who had been overlooked, forgotten, the ones who had never been given a voice, the leadership. Emma brought, that day when Emma finished her speech, no trainee remained seated. No one turned away. Even though her words were short, they carried the power of a generation that wanted change, that wanted to do what's right, that wanted to live correctly. They knew they would no longer be hidden in the silence of the past, but instead would stand firm, face the truth, and fight for justice. And Emma, in all her resilience, had become the guide, the leader not just by words, but by her actions. The system may change, but that change will not come from the outside. It will come from the people within it. Emma Jordan showed them that in order to change society, they must first change themselves. And that's what the young officers, the police officers of the future, will carry in their hearts when they step into the world of justice. Emma was more than a police officer. Emma was no longer just a police officer. She had become a symbol of change, of uncompromising justice. Her actions didn't just help her gain recognition. They sparked a flame of hope for all those overlooked. In a society where silence was sometimes the only form of safety, Emma Jordan didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for all those who needed a voice in this system. Her question will live on, not only in the present generation, but in the future, as a reminder that justice is never a privilege, but a right for all of us. Emma Jordan's story is a powerful example of how one individual can change a system rife with injustice. Her simple question became a symbol of resistance against racism and injustice in society. Emma wasn't perfect, but she was the one who dared to stand up when everything became murky. This story conveys a powerful message. A small question can change an entire world. Thank you for following the gripping and emotional story of Emma Jordan and Nathan Cole. We hope this story has sparked profound reflections on justice, power, and change in society. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next videos. We always bring interesting stories, life lessons, and inspiring shares. Leave a comment below to let us know what you think about this story, and don't forget to share the video if you find it helpful. We're looking forward to hearing more of your thoughts, and together we'll continue the journey to explore these powerful stories. Thank you once again, and we'll see you in the next videos.